There we
Um,
go. All right. Very happy to introduce Madeline Wolf and Joshu to talk about their very fun article about why device drivers are hard. Take it away, Madeline.
yeah. And Joshua, maybe you can keep an eye on the comments for questions. Okay, so device drivers are hard is the name of this talk. I am Madeline. I asked Joshu to come because we collaborated on the article that came before this talk. I promised him he would not have to prepare anything in advance, so I'll lead the talk itself, but he is much more of an expert in actual driver development. So when y'all inevitably have great technical questions, he will be answering a lot of them. Okay, so who are we? We originally met working at Zymergen, which became Ginkgo Bioworks, on a team that was developing a new automation technology. Jonas, who is sneakily in this call, was also deeply involved in that. Uh, so if you have thoughts, I guess you're welcome to share as well. We developed a platform that allowed for modular integration of lab devices. So basically, Lego-like work cells, for those who are familiar. I'm more of a sort of quote unquote traditional lab automation engineer, and Joshu is a software engineer who has now spent many, many years focused on device drivers, among other things involved in automation software development. I currently run a website called The Automated Lab, which is
Hey, Eddie. All right. Come on in and stuff. How are you?
Doing
hello.
well. How are you? I'm gonna go ahead and mute Andy.
That's
So I think we got a Bravo PM and a plate lock.
It's classic.
Yeah,
Um,
he's talking about automation. It's
Hey,
great.
listen, it's relevant. Okay. Um, anyway, the Animated Lab is the internet's first free education website for lab automation engineers. So this presentation started as an article. If you decide that you love this presentation and you want to share it with all your friends, there is a link to a much more concise version of this talk somewhere in the notes. And without further ado, I'm going to start with what is a device driver? So a lot of folks will know this, but device driver is kind of a varied term, so I'm going to be very specific here. Within the world of lab automation, a device driver refers to this piece of software that sits between some lab device and generally scheduling software or any other kind of software stack. And what this little piece of software's job is to couple these things together. There's basically two sides to the device driver. There's the side that is tailored to the lab device, and the other side, which is tailored to the software it's connecting to. So what this allows you to do is, if you have a little work cell, like this one in the bottom here, you need software that allows the kind of higher level software to talk to every single device and send commands and receive information from it. So in the bottom corner over here, we have kind of a fictional example of what a device driver might look like for a plate sealer. So plate sealer, it applies heat sealers to a plate. Very simple functions. If you're walking up to it in the lab, generally speaking, you'll put a plate on. Maybe you change some settings and then you press go and it seals your plate. If you want another piece of software to programmatically interface with your plate sealer, you're going to need to write a device driver and expose some commands. So I broke it out into three sections here, and this is a very lightweight version, but it's a good example. So first is like the primary device functions, which is to set the temperature and then seal a plate. And then maybe those have some parameters that allow you to change the settings slightly on the fly. And that'll technically get you everywhere you need to go with a device. But probably you want a slightly more robust work cell than that. And so you'll also want to expose some like status monitoring commands. So you can let the scheduling software ping a device maybe before it places a plate onto that device to say, what is your status? Are you ready to accept plates? And if there's an error, what is that error message? Is that something we can resolve or not? Or at least we can log it, maybe. And then maybe that's enough to kind of send up a little ping and say, there's an error here, and an engineer can go to the work cell and make some changes and recover it. But since we're already exposing all this great information, why not also expose the recovery commands so that we can do that remotely, perhaps? And so then you can add extra commands like resetting the error and retrying a seal and some of the kind of more basic things you would do for error recovery from a device. So as you can see, like there's kind of the core features you want from your driver, but it kind of can get as creative as you want. So that is sort of what the meat of this presentation is about. Uh, Anyone here who has worked with work cells and devices has probably complained about drivers at some point. They are kind of a good punching bag. Uh, and as we're kind of going to get into, it's not entirely their fault. Sometimes it is, but really it's sort of the nature of what this software does. So maybe I'll pause here really quick. Do we understand what device drivers are? Any quick questions here? All right. Is there anything here? Nope. Cool. All right. So,
Nico's got his hand raised.
oh, okay. I can't see anything. Go for it.
Okay, hi. I just wanted to know if there's a clear boundary between driver and more complex software or more complex tasks. Does it store state or does it just manage communication? That kind of
Joshua?
question.
Does Joshua want to jump in there?
Sure. Yeah. I think the usually the approach that we've taken has been to try to keep state storage as slim as possible. To the point that Madeline was making about this being like an adapter between whatever kind of application you're using to interact with this device to the device itself. Um, you can like depending on your use case, storing state in the driver is something that you could do. But if you want to kind of have I think there may be some points later about the ideas of like how much you put into a driver and how much interpretation you do in there that could speak to this. But one of the main approach that I and others around me have taken in the past here has been to make the device driver kind of as minimal as possible. So like ideally if it restarts, you don't have to reconstruct any information or whatever.
And that leads very nicely into what's coming next. So I'm actually going to spoil kind of the ending of this first to contextualize, but the main thesis we came to in developing why it's so hard to write device drivers is that they are fundamentally about expressing intent. And so there's fundamentally no correct way to do it. But there's a lot of incorrect ways to do it, which is really fun. Uh, so we've broken this down to kind of a couple different categories that we'll go over now. So first reason is that devices do different things. This is obvious, but it's really worth saying. It's sort of, if you kind of put even a couple of seconds of thought into it, absurd to think that two different device drivers or two different devices could run off the same device driver because a liquid handler and a plate sealer and a plate reader are just very different devices. So, on one level, there's just the what do you expect out of the device? So, if you have maybe a plate shaker, which, just a small thing, that is very simple. You want it to start, you want it to stop. There's not much else going on there. Versus a liquid handler, which is it contains a bunch of robots within itself. A liquid handler is basically running its own scheduling software within it. And there's a lot of kind of moment-to-moment activity that could go wrong and might require feedback. And then you have a plate reader, which doesn't have as much activity, but then it has a bunch of data outputs, and you have to make a bunch of decisions about what you want to do with that data. And then that circles back to the science. So if you want to write a good device driver, you need to be a little bit of an expert in kind of the process engineering and the basic science behind either the device or the process you are doing, because a plate reader and what you want out of it is going to look different if you're in, say, a clinical app where you're running the same general process over and over, and maybe you have just like a very clear pass-fail metric that you run and it never changes. And so maybe you design your device driver where you output very little data. It's mostly just a thumbs up for the plate or a thumbs up per well. Or maybe you're in like an R&D space where you're going to change what you want out of the plate reader every time. And maybe you want all the raw data so you can run your own fancy data pipeline. Maybe you want the data passed through the kind of the plate reader software for some normalization before you get a result. And these are all choices that can be made and have a correct situation to apply them to. But now, as a software engineer or device or driver developer, you need to know just enough to make sense of why you're making these choices. Um, Now, switching from kind of logistical to cultural, uh, my grand thesis about why lab automation is frustrating is that it exists within the world of things like biotechnology and pharmaceuticals, where the entire industry is basically based on IP, right? If you're doing pharma, you develop a drug, you've got like 10 years to get as much money out of that of your IP as possible before it goes to the public. And I've seen that kind of trickle down to how decisions are made about revealing information. That doesn't explain all of this, but I think it explains some of it. If you kind of try to publish some information about your technology and the lawyer looks at it, they're like, I don't know, looks like trade secrets to me. And it gets a little bit more obscured. Um, so API documentation within the world of lab automation is, I mean, God bless them if it's actually there. Uh, but even if it is there, it's not necessarily being maintained with the kind of rigor that many more traditional software engineers expect out of our current world of like open documentation, even open source. Um, it is pretty common to get like a Xeroxed PDF that is like three logos deep and three acquisitions deep of a device that like no engineers currently exist who are involved with the development of it at that company. And so if there's a mistake in that document, it just may never get updated. And this is just going to make the development harder. There's a lot more detective work involved in driver development than in, I think, other areas of software. I think I saw a comment pop up. Okay. I'm gonna let Joshu just interrupt if there's a question. Okay.
Sure, yeah. So the question was about whether a driver is a layer of abstraction over the device's native API. Um, that's that's true in cases where I guess it I would say more than API, it's an abstraction over the device's interface. Sometimes you have a device that connects over USB to the computer that's running the driver, and you're provided with like a Windows DLL or a header file or something that you can use to interact with it. Sometimes the device connects over Ethernet, and you have to just send ASCII over the wire to it. Sometimes the device connects over a serial cable, and then you really just have to send ASCII over the wire to it. So depending, or in the case of that Madeline was talking about of some liquid handlers where they're a more sophisticated piece of software, they have their own software. You're interfacing with their software directly, so there's kind of a driver to device going on there almost. But you're really, I think that one of the big purposes of driver software is to take uh, whatever one of the various interfaces you might be provided and normalize it into something that you can interact with in a predictable way.
Yeah. So with that, I'll jump to hardware and software are different. And this is something where I would love Josh you to kind of fill in the details because this is where my experience kind of fails. But generally speaking, in the world of pure software development or like software to software automation and software to software integration, you're expected to send lots and lots of signals per second. So thousands of signals per second are sent between two pieces of software. And the vast majority of them are not actually even going to get read, but that's okay. That is part of the protocol, and software to software communication works well this way. That absolutely does not work within the world of software to hardware. So if you imagine like a work cell again, hardware is going to be sending a couple signals per minute, maybe. Or if we look at something like a thermal cycler, we might be getting a couple signals every few hours. And if you miss those signals, we have a very big problem. So let's imagine we put a plate into a thermal cycler, or rather a robot puts a plate into a thermal cycler. It runs with a really long process. It goes a 5-hour incubation. And then after that, it needs to go to a plate reader to get a nice time-sensitive measurement. If the software misses the little, like, I'm done now signal, we have a problem. Like the process is broken now. So that obviously doesn't work. So therefore, as a software engineer, you have to make a bunch of choices about um, how do we accommodate the realities of hardware? And I know there's some very computationally heavy versions of this, like just polling really aggressively, which maybe chews up all of your local computing, which is a whole other issue. You kind of need to do local computing as opposed to cloud computing, which is more standard. There are aspects of lab automation that work fine with cloud computing, like put your limbs up there, I don't care. But you don't want a robot to be checking in with a server elsewhere between every single movement, or you're going to have again, even milliseconds of latency is going to be a huge pain over the course of thousands or tens of thousands of steps within your, multi-hour process. Um, and so there's a lot of trade-offs between kind of what is considered the gold standard of solutions within the pure software world, which maybe a lot of software engineers are more used to, and what are the realities of hardware and not just hardware, but biologically driven hardware where time sensitivity is going to be really important here and not there. And so ultimately, these are not problems that are necessarily unsurmountable, but they are going to put you in a position where you're making trade-offs between a couple of not perfect solutions. And you might not realize that you've like made a mistake, perhaps, until you're at scale or until you've introduced three other devices a couple years later and you realized, well, now that these two are interacting with each other, we have a new problem. Are there any cases, Joshua, that jump to mind that are worth complaining
Ye-
about?
Yeah, so I think one of the examples that actually Jonas might be familiar with, because this was one of the first things that he assigned me to do when I started working here like 7 years ago, um, was we had a problem with a device that turned out to be a problem with the network stack. So this was a device that we communicated with directly over, like you plug an Ethernet cable into one end, you plug an Ethernet cable into your computer, and you talk to it. And we had it I think communicating with something in the cloud. And the to Madeline's point about the way that software to software communication works, there's this assumption that you can just retry any communication that happens, and there's an assumption that you will retry any failed communication that happens. And because of the paradigm that the people who were designing this device were working under, um, I think that their development process looked more like plugging it directly into a computer than doing things that we were doing, of having it communicate to a cloud, like communicate to a different data center or talking to it over Wi-Fi. And so the retry logic of I missed something going across the network, retransmit, got really broken. And it was hard to fix that, because in the software world, often asking for a retransmit or a recalculation or whatever of a message just requires like run the computation again. And maybe that's expensive, but maybe you cache the output because of that. But in the hardware world, that means like if you're telling something to do an operation again, that's like maybe it can't. Maybe the operation that you did changed the world in some fundamentally irreversible way, and doing it again is not safe. So there's kind of that, I don't know, squaring that circle that you have to deal with.
Yeah, I think we also see a lot of sort of slower timescales with how hardware, like even well-built hardware, will try to do some retries. It'll try to like signal the fact that it didn't quite cast a message, but that might happen on the order of like a 60-second timeout versus a 1 second timeout. And so you can get a situation where everything is technically behaving fine, but software has lacked the hardware so many times that it thinks there's a problem, which is just a fun little nightmare. Yes, please unmix the liquids and try again. The thing I think of is just robot crashes. You move a plate from one place to another. You're not sure if it works. You try it again. Well, now if you try it again, you're going to crash, and all hell has broken loose. All right. This kind of hits on what Joshua was saying a moment ago. Standards are fun. Let's make another one. This is a brief list of the various ways that a device will expect you to communicate with it. So this goes back to that point about, are you just dealing with APIs? Sometimes. I think that's becoming increasingly true, but it's very different. So the simplest version might be, again, like in a plate shaker, you probably just plug like a serial cable into it and send some basic commands. Um, Or maybe you have something like a liquid handler, which has very different demands, and it makes sense to make it different, right? So you have a piece of software that sits over a liquid handler, which is great because you don't want to have to rewrite from scratch how you develop scripts for your liquid handler and how you design liquid classes and how you program labware. Like it's good to have software over a liquid handler that is vendor specialized. But now the driver has to figure out how to interface with that software. And then God forbid that changes over time, right? I think we've had the experience of software that has tried to keep up with the world of integrated systems. And so when we first developed the driver, it it's a little bit clunky, and then they release an API, and then there's a whole question about how mature is that API? Do we switch over now? There may be vendor provided libraries that connect to the device. There may be some combination of these three things. There's also the question of which computers are like what are the computing requirements of these devices and their software and the libraries they provide. So a lot of lab devices expect you to only use Windows PCs, which is fine if you're just walking up to devices in the lab. But my general understanding is when you want to do like fancy integrated systems, you generally want to use like Linux machines. Uh, and so I think we've had to come up with all sorts of contrived ways to like stick Windows within a Linux machine or like tether them together. And this liquid handler will only work if you give it its own special computer by itself. So now you have to tether multiple computers together. Um, and then, of course, there's like the pirate map version of this, where they give you some PDF with the instructions for how to develop your driver, and like probably that works, maybe. Uh, and again, this kind of circles back to like drivers are hard for reasons that are inherent. But boy, if you're the developer, it's really annoying. Yes, okay.
Hey, I've got
And
a question.
yeah.
You said a lot of these devices expect to use a Windows machine, they use a Windows DLL, and I guess my question is, what's up with that?
Do you know the answer, Joshu? I don't.
I mean, I think that I don't have a clear answer. All I have is speculation. But my speculation is largely around the fact that like Windows has provided like you can pay Windows to get Windows in a way that, I mean, I guess you can with some Linux distributions as well, but like you're paying somebody for a service, and Windows has really prioritized backwards compatibility. Like I think one of the reasons why Windows gets so much hate, including from me, is because they've just decided like they're not going to do the Mac thing and say like, yeah, that software that worked like 5 years ago, that's not going to work anymore. Like figure it out yourself. Like there's very much a culture of backwards compatibility. And then with like academic institutions, I think often you find that someone's like running a like Windows 95 computer
Yeah.
connected to some like tomography machine or something to like not definitely not drawing from specific experiences. Yeah.
I imagine also it's yeah, as Lisa's kind of saying, like Windows is probably cheaper. So if we imagine that all these like all these automation friendly devices generally emerged from walk-up automation, I imagine just a lot more sane and reasonable to ship out a little Windows PC with your device rather than paying top price for a Mac, which may or may not be super great for other reasons.
Right.
Uh,
And to the point about like these developing from walk-up machines, like doing doing development for something like this on a Mac would be such a pain. And I say that as a Mac user. And also, if you send somebody, if you expect somebody to run like Ubuntu on their laptop to connect to your device, you're a jerk. Like that's not a reasonable thing to do. The reason why we're looking for like Linux connecting to things is not because we're expecting to use it as a workstation operating system. And the rise of Linux as even a possibility in that space, and the rise of like Mac OS as a primary operating system for a lot of people is still relatively recent. So I think that a lot of these companies that are making fairly safe bets are doing development for Windows because of this.
yeah. I feel like a lot of challenges with lab automation can trace down to. This made sense all along the development pipeline, right up until we got to the point where we wanted to stick a bunch of these devices onto a single system, which is frustrating. And maybe it'll make me jump ahead to you need a device to develop a good driver. And this is I think one of the most frustrating things within the world of lab automation. So reasons behind this are every device, again, we talked about, let's pretend your documentation is perfect. It won't be. Let's pretend it is. You can write a driver that theoretically meets spec, and then you plug it into a device that finally arrives, and something goes wrong. Maybe most of it works just fine, but there are some edge cases that don't work. There's, some magic string somewhere that's expecting that has changed since this documentation came out. There are issues with software versions and firmware versions. So again, you got two different liquid handlers in your lab. One of them's running on software version, 1.0.3. The other one's on 1.5.2. And somewhere along that path, there was a change that probably doesn't impact you as a walk-up user, but does impact the programmatic interfacing with the device. And you don't necessarily discover that until you actually plug your device into your system with your current driver version. This gets even more challenging with firmware because firmware gets updated far less frequently and reliably than software, which is generally fine if you're talking about walk-up devices. You don't really want to mess with a device that's already working. It generally requires like a field service engineer to come in to make firmware changes. And the life cycle on lab hardware is quite long. Like it's very reasonable to have a decades old device that is running just great in your lab. And then you might have the same model of device that was produced a couple years ago. Uh, and you'll realize they are running on totally different firmware. And there are some fundamental differences between how a driver needs to interface with those devices. And you don't find that out until you go to swap out, your broken XPeel for your redundant XPeel and realize the system no longer works because there is a difference between these two devices. That's, again, even with the best documentation, there's just no way it's going to cover a list of all the changes between all firmware versions and all software versions. Um, and this becomes really frustrating because, so Josh and I worked on a team where we were only integrating devices that we had on hand. So thankfully that for the most part wasn't too much of a challenge. Um, but if we were ordering a new device, you do, 80% of the development up front and hope that it basically works. And then you have to reserve a bunch of time for testing and troubleshooting. And then even beyond that, you're going to expect another year or two after integrating a device of what weird quirk is not going to come up until this one particular scenario. There is always some secret little trick that is buried within there that may, again, differ between two devices of the same model. But this was really challenging for, anyone who's developing automation software who is not manufacturing their own equipment. So I think about Biosero, which has changed a lot as a company. So this is less true now. But like a decade ago, they make Green Button Go. It's a scheduling software, lovely little software stack. We had some trouble with them where they would develop they would make updates to a device driver for a very common device, and the updates were at our request to expose more functionality. And we would install that driver and realize that something was slightly wrong because there was like either a small typo in their development or a small typo in, again, the documentation they were using because they didn't have the device on hand. And so it takes, potentially days, weeks, even months of back and forth with the software developers to actually get something right if you don't have the device on hand. Which is why it was such a blessing to be a lab automation engineer where I could directly speak to the software engineers working on development.
Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Do we have some questions? Chop security. There we go. Uh, cool. Actually, I'm not seeing questions. Yeah, and so this is something where it kind of doesn't seem like a pain until you want to have like parallelization of work. Because there's also the question of like, if you have a device that is like six figures, you don't necessarily have a second one. And if you want to do development on it, you are taking away from production time, which is, an inherent trade-off that gets pretty frustrating.
And I would add that this is also one of the reasons I think that that there are fewer like that when you see companies even device manufacturers who are developing things like device drivers and things like larger automated systems, the scope of them can be really limited because like if you're working at like TCAN, you're not necessarily going to be writing a bunch of software. You're not going to have easy access to like high res devices in the same way that high res has access to high res devices. And so in a like I feel particularly fortunate that in the situation where Madeline and I were working on this, we were not working at a device manufacturer. We were working at like basically a user of devices of lab devices. So we had access to like we didn't have to care which company manufactured the different devices. We could choose one that worked for our needs, and then we could work to integrate that.
Yeah. And this circles back to that like culture of obscurity point, which is, if you these are different device manufacturers could theoretically be sharing information openly so that everyone always provided a really seamless interface for their end users. That is not the way lab automation as an industry works right now, which is a bummer. But even from where, Josh and I were sitting, it's really tough to get someone to answer questions, partly because they're not used to answering questions about APIs and interfaces and how do you communicate with this device, and partly because they might not know how to answer it correctly. Or I think we once tried to get a meeting with a device manufacturer because like, hey, we're buying your device, we would like to integrate it into our system. And they were like so confused by the fact that we were doing this that they ended up trying to pitch us on their integration services, which was frustrating because we were an integration company at the time. Like it just all of these things meshed together in frustrating ways, which I think so yeah gets us to the last sort of category here, and we'll sum it up. Um, is so drivers are like poetry is a reference to a PyCon talk from 2014 that I have linked in the article version of this. That basically says that the APIs are like poetry and that you are ultimately trying to express some kind of assumptions about your device. And in fact, it's like a chain of assumptions and a chain of communications on top of each other. So the device manufacturer has made a bunch of assumptions and what they've made possible through their device interface, whether that's an API, whether that's software, whether that's a complete lack of software or API. And then you as the driver developer are making another set of assumptions and putting that into this sort of document of communication that ultimately an engineer and then an end user will make use of in some way. And there are a lot of choices. So you can make a very bloated driver where you can expose a lot of functionality in a lot of crazy ways, and you can even sort of almost fabricate methods that aren't natively possible or not, you can make higher level and more abstracted commands accessible through a driver. You can only expose what is directly available on the device, but you can expose absolutely everything and every possible parameter. We'd call that like a very thin driver. That is basically just carrying on the assumptions of the device manufacturer. Or you can make a really tailored and assumption heavy driver where you only expose what you think is the bare minimum. And there are cases where any of those decisions might be a good idea. Uh, and ultimately, someone's going to be a little frustrated no matter what because everyone's assumptions are going to be slightly different. So it was, again, really great to work directly with the software engineers working on these because I, as the very picky automation engineer, could say, no, 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 I want more. Like, give me more options here. And then we could negotiate as to whether that made sense. Like, if we imagine some centrifuge drivers, generally speaking, it is possible to program in a whole lot of parameters that the average person should not be touching. You can set obviously the velocity and the acceleration and deceleration of various steps, but generally speaking, we hard code a lot of that in because it, there's no point in changing it. We know what generally works unless you're doing something extremely fancy. It doesn't really matter. And the more you expose to your engineers and to your end users, the more opportunities you're giving them to make mistakes that are destructive in some way. And so there's always going to be this trade-off between overly limiting and overly empowering the engineers and end users who are making use of the drivers. So ultimately, like there isn't really a correct answer, but it is really fantastic to be able to go back and forth with the people who are locking in those assumptions. I'm seeing some comments come up. Anything?
There was one question from Tim about that kind of like backwards compatibility, and I mean I think I think the answer is really just that, like, why other companies aren't kind of following this model that I alluded to with Microsoft of backwards compatibility. I think the answer is just that, like, it's expensive to do, and I think that, to Madeline's point earlier, like, if the expected lifetime of this device is really long, and you aren't expecting to do like firmware updates, like there isn't as much of a requirement for it. Like the thing that I mentioned in the chat of getting a response for some documentation with this question is rarely asked. I I thought that was really funny at the time and was kind of frustrated with that response, but I also think that it's entirely true. I think that I was probably the first person to ask for that documentation.
Yeah, there's something to be said about a lot of the issues we run into doing kind of more on the advanced side of lab automation is that like it's more on the advanced side of lab automation and people aren't necessarily doing it en masse. It's pretty abnormal for like a synthetic biology company, which is where we worked, to also be developing their own internal automation. Like there's a reason Hi-Res exists and all these other companies exist. Um, okay, good chat happening. I'm not seeing more. Did Luis
Luis said he had a question.
Yeah, sorry, I can't find the like raise my hand
Go
thing
for it.
on the phone. So I'm sort of curious, like, how do you feel about this movement in lab automation right now to develop basically at the level of the firmware? I'm sure you've seen like PyLab Robot and maybe other initiatives. Do you have a feeling for that, or do you have any like sort of commentary about that? I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you have a spicy take?
Always, always, always. Um, yeah, so first is I love it. However, I kind of suspect that it is a annoying middle state. I think Pylab Rabbit kind of does this better than some others that I've seen where there's entire companies built around can we hack around like Hamilton software? Can we hack around Tecan software? And that feels like fundamentally inefficient in a way that like all that would need to change to make that company irrelevant is for Tegan to get its act together, right? To again put it in a spicy way. Um, and so I think a lot of this current movement we're seeing is so deeply needed. Like the fact that people are working on this open source software is hopefully challenging a lot of the industry to be more open with information. It's also why I started the automated lab, just to kind of prove that people want to read information. And I've already seen that kind of inspire some companies to be a little bit more forthcoming with their information and to even use open source as a marketing term, even when they're not necessarily all that open source. Um, um, and so yeah. And then I guess the other side of this is what are we talking about with lab automation? There's like a huge spectrum of what people are trying to do and what they need out of automation. If we're talking about the world of like clinical labs, I don't know that something like PyLab or whatever is ever necessarily going to make it into that environment for all sorts of cultural and logistical reasons and regulatory reasons. But also, there's a lot of people, putting a bioreactor in their kitchen or whatever a friend is doing here
That's
on the
true.
call.
Well,
Um,
well, I do want to say I think that is something that, like depending on your environment, right? There's both the R&D, you're developing something, and then there's the clinical. Like I think something like CSV, a computer system validation, this is something, or systems engineers doing V&V testing or other things. These are things that these vendors can do and provide documentation for. And so when you move away from that, you're at risk and you potentially create massive headaches for vendors. And then they have a support team now answering questions that they're not trained to answer. So I think it's like we both want cheaper hardware. We want it to be more open and accessible. And then there's the reality of, well, that may come at the expense of the cost of the hardware raising if you want those added features, because then your support is still just as rigid as it was before. So I feel like I would be angry if somebody were taking away my support guys because they decided to try all these firmware commands without really doing any kind of testing, right?
yeah,
So I feel like it's a confluence of factors that maybe leads into it, but I can tell you as at a manufacturing company right now, like, we do a lot to test parameters, and the centrifuge example is a really great example. So I'm really glad you brought that up.
yeah. Yeah. As someone who has like a fairly rational fear of centrifuges, I heard some horror story about
No,
industrial.
totally. Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Hey,
yeah,
time
no,
time
it's
check, Madeline. We've got about 4 minutes left, so I want to make sure you have time to say all the things you definitely want to say.
yeah, no, this is the last slide. This is a summary. I guess I'll just call out. I sent the link to everybody. It's in the notes doc. It has the link to the original article for this. It has a link to a really cool liquid handler, like super user chatbot that my business partner Suda, who I think is in this call, has spent a lot of time on. It's currently an expert on Hamiltons, and we will be slowly releasing more devices over time. I have a link to Ginkgo Automation, which is the company that Joshu still works at and I used to work at. They make really cool automation. And also, I'm just going to plug the Sila 2 and OPC UA LADs. These are two actual device standards. If you're going to develop a new device, try using a standard. That would be cool. Like um, to Luis's point, like there are changes that could be made that would ease a lot of these challenges. Some of them are kind of never going to go away, but there is a world where the approach to documentation and the approach to using standards just changes over time. So, yeah, that's all I got. Josh, you?
Awesome.
Yeah, I
Uh,
mean, I would add to the to what Luis was saying, that like uh as a person who writes software, there are some accesses in the software that I really don't want people to have. And like it's, you know, it's for safety, it's for like not having to write things defensively. Like when you're writing anything, you want to know who your audience is. And I think that like directly accessing the firmware, well, I love hardware hacking, I love reverse engineering. I think everyone should be legally allowed to do it. Um, I I worry about, like, you know, I don't want people going into something that, like, I feel like the difference between the software I was working with at previous jobs and the software I'm working with here is like software that interacts with hardware can literally physically harm someone. And I think that especially coming from a software background, it's like that's something you really got to internalize.
Yeah.
all right. Well, let's leave it there. And I just have to find the stop recording button. There it is. Let's give a round of applause for Madeline and Joshu.
Thank you, Josh.
Visual, however, whatever emoji reacts.